Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of historical and political analysis based on Daniel Hacker's academic thesis. We are looking at Rudi Dutschke. Now, if you know the 1960s student movement in Germany, you know he was a massive, highly prominent figure, but honestly, often totally misunderstood. Specifically, we're going to examine his lifelong search for a revolutionary third way. He was basically looking for this highly theoretical path that stood firmly between Western capitalism on one side and Soviet-style communism on the other. It's a pretty dense, complex worldview, but by breaking down his specific arguments, we can really get a feel for the architecture of his political thought. Let's move to and see how this builds. Here is our visual roadmap of the 5 specific sections we'll use to unpack these dense theories today. Number 1, his formative years in both East and West Germany. 2, his time with the SDS. 3, his totally new theory of revolution. 4, his critique of the Soviet Union. And finally, number 5, his ultimate goal, a council democracy. All right, let's jump right into section 1, Prägung in Ost und West. Basically, we need to objectively look at his early influences and formative experiences across a divided Germany. To truly wrap our heads around Dutschke's later theories, we absolutely must look at his childhood. His worldview wasn't just read in a textbook, right? It was actually lived. He was born in 1940 in East Germany, and his early life was entirely defined by the aftermath of World War II. In 1945, his very first encounter with Soviet soldiers was actually shockingly positive. They confiscated his family's bicycle, sure, but they gave them another one, and he distinctly remembered them having friendly eyes. But jump ahead to 1953, and the narrative totally flips. He literally witnessed the Soviet military crushing the East German workers' uprising in the streets. This was a massive, massive shock to him. Finally, in 1961, literally right before the Berlin Wall went up, he moves to West Berlin to study, suddenly finding himself dropped into a completely different capitalist system. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how vividly Dutschke recalled that 1953 turning point. He noted that the eyes of the Soviet soldiers, they just weren't the liberating eyes of 1945 anymore. Instead, he described them as the oppressive and strained eyes of a Red Army moving against the GDR workers and against us. This specific lived memory completely cemented a lifelong, deeply personal distrust of Soviet-style communism for him. From that moment on, authoritarianism from the left was just as unacceptable to him as authoritarianism from the right. So once he's over in the West, Dutschke doesn't just abandon his deep-seated Lutheran roots. Instead, he actually blends them with a really rigorous study of some specific Marxist thinkers. From Georg Lukács, he takes this idea of voluntarism, basically the belief that human action and willpower are what actually drive history. From Ernst Bloch, he grabs elements of utopian Marxism. And probably most importantly, from Herbert Marcuse, he absorbs this profound critique of modern, late-stage capitalism. Marcuse had this theory of the one-dimensional man, someone completely trapped by consumerism and technological efficiency. This blend of ideas, that became the total foundation of Dutschke's unique worldview. Okay, moving on to section 2, Dutschke und der SDS. Let's look at his radical student years. This brings us to 1965, when he enters the SDS, the Socialist Student Union, which he pretty quickly starts to dominate theoretically. But, as we know, the SDS eventually fractured and collapsed. And Dutschke was actually incredibly analytical about why this happened. He neutrally reported a few fatal flaws. First, he felt they were romanticizing anti-imperialist campaigns abroad way too much, while totally ignoring their own boring domestic economic realities at home. Second, severe organizational failures. It was just too chaotic, lots of spontaneous student action, but zero cohesive structure. Third, they completely lacked a long-term strategic perspective. And lastly, and this is a big one for a Marxist group, they couldn't objectively define who the modern working class even was anymore. So, when the SDS fell apart, the radical left fractured right along with it. On one side, you had Dutschke's vision, which was an anti-authoritarian, completely decentralized movement based on self-organization. But on the other side, you had the rise of the K groups, these neo-Leninist splinter groups. They adopted strict, dogmatic, top-down hierarchies, basically worshiping the Soviet or Chinese communist models. Dutschke heavily criticized these groups. He saw them as a massive step backwards, arguing that their strict, unquestioning discipline was literally just reproducing the authoritarian society they claimed to hate, just wrapped up in left-wing aesthetics. Section 3. Eine neue Revolutionstheorie. Here is where we examine how Dutschke formulated his own distinct, highly subjective theory of revolution. And this brilliantly illustrates his striking departure from the old guard. Orthodox Marxism always dictated that the traditional factory workers, the industrial proletariat, were the revolutionary class because they were the most exploited. But Dutschke looked around at the post-war economic boom in West Germany and said, well, the modern working class is too integrated into capitalism now. They have good wages, consumer goods. They have more to lose than just their chains. So he proposed what he called a Randgruppen strategy, a strategy focusing on marginalized groups and students. He didn't think students could actually pull off a revolution all by themselves, but he argued they had to act as the avant-garde spark to wake everyone else up. Central to this whole strategy was this crucial concept called the subjektiver factor, or subjective factor. You see, traditional socialists often just waited passively for capitalism to inevitably collapse from its own economic crises. They treated it like a waiting game. Dutschke totally rejected that. Borrowing from Che Guevara and George Lukács, he put all the emphasis on human willpower. He believed that a revolution depends on the conscious, direct, practical action of people getting out there and making history themselves, rather than just waiting around for history to happen to them. All right, Section 4, Kritik am Realsozialismus. Let's transition to his intense academic critique of the Soviet Union. To analyze exactly why the Soviet Union failed, Dutschke used this dense historical concept called the Asiatic mode of production. Basically, in traditional Marxist theory, a society has to go through a bourgeois capitalist revolution before it can achieve a socialist one. It's like a stepping stone. Dutschke argued that Russia completely skipped this step. Before 1917, Russia was mostly a peasant society relying on state despotism. They didn't have a developed industrial working class. So he concluded that Russia simply never had the economic preconditions for true socialism in the first place. In his eyes, Lenin forced a revolution onto a society that just wasn't ready, meaning it was always inevitably doomed to become a dictatorship. And because the conditions weren't right, Lenin relied on this model called democratic centralism, which basically demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience to the party leadership. Dutschke completely rejected this. He didn't see it as liberation, he saw it as a direct hangover from czarist oppression. He argued it inevitably created an uncritical dictatorial party elite. This conviction actually led Dutschke to do something super controversial. He defended Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago. Think about the irony there, a radical Marxist fiercely defending a famous anti-communist book. While orthodox leftists were screaming that it was just propaganda, Dutschke said no, socialists have to face the brutal reality of Soviet crimes. For him, human rights and democratic freedoms were absolutely non-negotiable for any true socialism. So, the crucial point is this. If Western capitalism was alienating and exploitative to him, and Soviet communism was clearly dictatorial and oppressive, what exactly was Dutschke's ultimate solution? What was his famous third way? That brings us to Section 5. Das Ziel, Rätedemokratie. The ultimate goal. Let's break down this concept clearly. Rated democracy translates to council democracy. This was his specific political framework, essentially an anarcho-Marxist third way that rejected both Western parliaments and Soviet dictatorships. Imagine if, instead of a parliament full of professional politicians making decisions hundreds of miles away, society was run directly by your neighborhood and your workplace. It's a highly decentralized system made up of self-organized producer councils and action committees. We're talking about radical, direct democracy from the absolute bottom up. So how did he envision this actually working in practice? He mapped it out in 3 ongoing steps. Step 1, form decentralized action committees that totally bypass traditional state bureaucracy. Just cut the state out entirely. Step 2, ensure direct self-organization from the working base. People educate themselves and manage their own affairs, a very Rosa Luxemburg kind of principle. And step 3, and this is the absolute key safety valve against corruption, maintain constant control from below. This includes the power to instantly recall any leader or delegate at any given moment. If a representative stops serving the people, boom, they are immediately removed. No entrenched power, no ruling class. And that brings us to our final thought. We've explored his total rejection of Soviet authoritarianism, his deep critique of Western capitalism, and this theoretical blueprint for a highly decentralized council democracy. Looking objectively at the source material, it really forces us to ask, in a world that is still so often polarized by rigid political binaries, does Dutschke's historical vision of a radical, bottom-up democracy offer a genuinely viable, practical alternative for us today? Or is it ultimately just a fascinating utopian dream?
It's a compelling question to leave you with, and one that absolutely invites deeper exploration into these historical theories. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.